we got people starting to roll in, I will say hello. I'm Adam Sled. I'm the Executive Director of the Dominion Energy Innovation Center. We're happy to be doing this virtual lunch and learn today with our friends. Debbie, do you want to say hi?
Absolutely. Good afternoon. I'm Debbie Hiscott. I'm the Executive Director of Smart City Works, and we are so thankful to Dominion and our esteemed speakers today for providing this panel during our Innovation Challenge, which is a 7-week challenge to support startups that are innovating with purpose. So thank you all for being here, and we hope you'll join us for our full series of events and finale of our pitch competition on May 16th as well.
Right.
Wonderful. Thanks.
So that's always a fun event and one we're really excited to support every year. And then it dovetails nicely with doing, our work around the state and our virtual lunch and learn series. So we've got a really fun topic this time. It works with the smart cities thing. It works with our general sort of decarbonization efforts. And so trying to bring in two of our startup friends from the DMV area who are working on an incredibly important topic, which is how do we keep our infrastructure grids in good working, optimized condition. And so we have Susan Ginsburg from Criticality Sciences and Mishal Thadani from Rhizome. And so this is what our typical structure is. They're each going to take 15 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes, and kind of walk us through their companies and what they're doing and their solution and how they're impacting the world around us. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So whether you're another startup working in this space or just sort of generally interested in how we're going to keep our grid infrastructure safe and in good working condition, check it out. We appreciate you being here, and we'll sort of have more discussion towards the end, but we like to just kind of dive in. And Susan, you get to go first. So you're gonna just feel free to jump in and start talking us through criticality.
All righty. Braden, put us up. Okay, first of all, thanks so much for having me here. I'm really interested to join the conversation. Dominion Energy Innovation Center has been really important to us. Very grateful for the opportunity. So go ahead, Braden. So why are we here? We're here because of catastrophic risk. We're here because we've entered a new era of risk. And that risk can come from all hazards, from any direction. We talk a lot about natural disasters and extreme weather these days, but accidents happen as well. Major blackouts happen because of accidents. And of course, physical attacks are an increasing concern, and even supply chain lapses. Anyway, a variety of sources for very major catastrophic events that are called in the industry high impact, low frequency events. Next slide. So a key aspect of these events is interdependency. Our systems have become so complex that when something happens in one of them, it often flows into another. And so this has made the scale of disasters much greater than it has been in the past. Next slide. So how are we coping with this? Well, really, most of our engineering is geared towards reliability, to keep operations going, as Adam said, optimized day to day. But when you're going to have failures, you need a different set of goals, a resilience goal to complement your reliability goal. So you want to keep operations going, but also recognize that there's going to be a moment when systems fail for whatever reason. So we say, let's take on resilience as a complementary goal to reliability and keep failures small and make sure you recover rapidly. We're saying that resilience is today really unmeasured and unmitigated in reliability engineering, and it also doesn't have financial drivers. So it's a real challenge to pay for the types of mitigation that resilience demands. Now, one of the things that's making it difficult is the lack of metrics. How do you measure resilience? There are a lot of qualitative ways of describing it, but fewer quantitative ways of measuring it. And even more so, measuring it across interdependent systems. So this makes it really hard for engineers to continuously improve. They have no baseline benchmarks. And it also makes it really hard to drive investment because investors can't see the value for every dollar put in resilience extracted. Next slide. So is it possible to find an approach to resilience? Yes, because there are new kinds of science that allow us to move forward in that direction. We have, for reliability, we have physical models. For resilience, we can draw on network science. For reliability, we have deterministic methods. For resilience, we can draw on probability science. And for standard reliability methods, you know, we're all familiar with asset management. We look at assets, we look at the threats to assets, we look at the hazards in relation to assets. But in resilience, we can also look at the entire system's vulnerability and the consequences to the system as a whole. Both of these sciences, both of these methods of engineering are complementary, reliability and resilience. Next slide. So Criticality Sciences has developed software called Net Resilience that seeks to fill this gap, at least in part, and we provide baseline metrics for resilience, a loss in dollars that's likely for your system in the case of a catastrophic impact, a Lewis score of what your resilience is from 0 to 10, and of course, a recovery time and cost from such events so that you can begin to make sure that your emergency preparedness is sufficient. So we also identify critical assets that can become the focus of mitigation. And we look at the efficiency of the investments in terms of their resilience outputs. Next slide. So this is the Lewis score. We identify a tipping point after which your system is more likely to tip into a catastrophic failure. That's what we want to avoid. This gives engineers a set of goals to keep that Lewis score up and to keep it improving. Next slide. We also look at a loss. This is where the financial people are interested, where the rate commissioners, the insurance industry, the planners in the utility. What is the most likely loss that's also relatively consequential? So we picked on a distribution a metric called maximum probable loss to give you an indication of a catastrophic loss that's likely for the system that you have. Next slide. So how does this look in the real world applied to real systems? So this is the transmission system for Brazil, effectively the equivalent of PJM for Brazil or all the ISOs. It's ISO Brazil, and they have a few times more transmission lines than Virginia and South Carolina for Dominion, but it's essentially the same kind of system. Next slide. So here's the Lewis score and the maximum probable loss for this system. You can see that their Lewis score is a little bit above 5. It's 6. And the risk that we identified, and this was an article published in 2022 to C. Gray, the Organization of Power Engineers, that the maximum probable loss in this system per hour was about 23% of their total risk. So if the whole system went down, it's about 23% of that. And the consequence measure here is the loss to ISO Brazil, not to the community. It's a simple measure of loss to the system as a whole. Next slide. So then the net resilience also identifies the the assets in the system that are most likely to be implicated in a cascade failure. And these are heavily masked. This is not a geographic map of the system. It's a heat map, but it does indicate the critical assets. And we have provided those. Next slide. Backup one. In 2023, a year after we provided these metrics, there was an actual blackout in Brazil, pretty much on the scale of our Northeast blackout that everyone at Dominion and in the industry generally remembers. Very major blackout in the United States. This was a very major blackout in Brazil. And Net Resilience had forecast a load shed of about 23%, as I showed you before. The actual event resulted in a load shed of 26%. And of the top 10 assets, the number one asset that we had identified as likely to be associated with cascade failure was in fact involved in this event, and also the fifth ranked asset. So this is how the system works. It gives you an indication of where you can go direct mitigation. Next slide. This is the same method applied to a water system. And here's a respectably sized municipal water system with a fair number of nodes and links, keeping it together. Next slide. For this system, we identified risk both for contamination and for all hazard risk at the request of the utility. And the utility gave us the values that they were interested in seeing measured, and in this case, it's the per day consequence for contamination and an event level risk for all hazard risk. And you can see that their Lewis scores are hovering around 5, a little bit below, a little bit above. And here we've added the recovery time and cost. So for a large event, you're looking at quite a bit of recovery time. And this is what's really significant. It's important for utilities to be able to anticipate how to recover, how much it's going to cost, how much the resources that will need to be dedicated, and the means of doing that. Next slide. So here again, we identify some of the assets that are likely to be involved in these cascade failures. Next slide. And I wanted to show you here how this gets translated into financial data. So how do you know how much money to invest to get resilience? Well, we're saying you have a goal, you want to get over 5 on the Lewis score, and you have a maximum probable loss that you want to reduce. Maybe you're having a discussion with your bond ratings agency, maybe with the insurance and reinsurance sector. Either way, you need a quantitative understanding of your unknown risk, of your catastrophic risk, of your high impact, low frequency event risk. So here in this case, we took 3 projects that were listed on that were part of the capital improvement asset management planning of a utility to see how much they did or did not contribute to resilience. And these were not projects that Criticality planned. They were projects that were already ongoing for this utility. So were they going to help resilience in addition to reliability? That was the question. So in this case, the benchmark baseline Lewis score was 3.4. The maximum probable loss was pretty low in relation to their overall risk. And of the 3 projects, they all contributed something to resilience. You can see that the first one, the replacement of a major main, resulted in a cost offset of 51%. So they were getting an additional resilience value for their reliability investment that offset an additional 51% of the cost. And that was definitely a contribution that could be shared with the rate commission. But if we were going to plan a resilience project, it would definitely have to be at least 100% offset of the cost. So we start with these. We show that they all increase the Lewis score, however, not sufficiently to put it over 5. And they all reduce the maximum probable loss somewhat, but not enough to justify them from a resilience perspective. Next slide. So this is our team. I myself have a legal background and came from work in the government and in particular with the 9/11 Commission, where I became very focused on catastrophic risk and specifically catastrophic risk to utilities. We have a data scientist on our team, a software engineer, and of course, a water and power engineer at the moment as we begin to apply these metrics in the different lifeline utility sectors for our critical infrastructure resilience. Next slide. Yeah, I think the final thing I'd like to say is that we named the company Criticality Sciences because we anticipate that a lot of sciences will be needed to address resilience. We have one approach. We expect there to be a lot of other approaches, and we welcome the dialogue with others. We need to all be working together to address the kinds of catastrophic failures that we're all going to be encountering. So thank you very much. Look forward to hearing from you, Mish.
Awesome. Thanks, Susan. And thanks for that. I think that's good. So I think this order works then, Mish, because she just gave us this like big, like, the network, the whole infrastructure, what happens when things start to fail, and how do we prevent that, right? And then you're more diving into the asset level. So yeah, jump in. I mean, you told me about Rhizome for the first time maybe 2 years ago. Does that sound right? You're still kind of in like stealth mode at that point.
That's exactly right. And great presentation, Susan. And Adam's spot on in that you're looking at the macro scale of interdependencies on critical infrastructure and what the effect is going to be to entire networks. And meanwhile, we're really focused in on evaluating at high resolution what are going to be the impacts of specific threats to specific assets and how to make the small everyday decisions to help build up resilience from the bottoms up in the system. So with that being said, I'm happy to dive in to some slides over here. So bear with me. What we do at Rhizome effectively is we help electric utilities, the people who manage and invest in our electric grid all the way from generation down to distribution. While we're focused mostly on distribution today, we anticipate working with the entire power system in the future. We're really helping the operators, the planners, and the folks who are managing the assets on an everyday basis, help make the right decisions at the right time with the right investments at a very high resolution. And what I'm going to describe is effectively an AI approach to understanding risk at high resolutions and how you can make effective decisions using quantitative cost-benefit analyses that these AI models actually enable. So, but to really give you a sense of my journey into climate resilience, and I just wanted to give you an understanding of where I'm coming from, is I started my career kind of down in the bottom left, doing utility scale wind and solar development, and have slowly made my way into the resilience space as opposed to the carbon mitigation space. And as I've been progressing in my career, I've gotten deeper and deeper on the technology side of things. So developing utility scale wind projects by no means is a tech startup atmosphere. But I then transitioned into the residential, commercial, and community solar space with a startup, that Astrum Solar, which was acquired by Direct Energy. Eventually started my own community solar development company when I saw a massive opportunity in that market. And we were actually trying to leverage these solar projects and solar plus storage projects as resilience mechanisms on the distribution scale when we were working with local utilities and local customers. But then, wanted to really solve hard utility issues through my knowledge of the regulatory sector. I spent a lot of time working on local issues in the District of Columbia related to grid modernization, increasing solar incentives, so on and so forth, and wanted to do that nationwide with technology that I thought really mattered, would be a game changer in the electric utility industry. Joined a company called Urbint, where we were deploying a few different AI products with 50 of the largest utilities in the country, and then saw a massive gap, which is where we started Rhizome about 1.5 years ago, to really give a tool in the hands of electric utility operators to make those everyday decisions related to curbing the increases in costs and impacts from extreme weather events. So diving straight in, this is what caused us to start the company. Over the last decade, extreme weather related power outages have increased by almost 4 times, whereas in the same period, the blue sky related power outages have largely remained flat. And what this tells us is obviously extreme weather events are getting more severe and intense and frequent, but what it also means is that utilities are very good at planning for reliability and not as good as planning for future resilience. And this is another dimension to the challenge. This is the Camp Wildfire that occurred back in 2019 that unfortunately was caused by PG&E's power lines. And this also adds a new dimension in the sense that not only were there tens of billions of dollars, actually I think hundreds of billions of dollars lost, just evaporated as a result of this wildfire. PG&E obviously went into bankruptcy, but also 85 people were killed, unfortunately, in this disaster. And it was all caused by one of the smallest things, one of the smallest assets that a utility has. And this is what's called a C-hook. So on a transmission tower that holds the transmission cables and takes it typically over vegetation, these C-hooks are actually holding a cable to a tower. And as you can see, over decades of degradation and rust, this C-hook actually ended up snapping. The wire ended up coming down and making contact with vegetation that ended up causing that Camp Wildfire. Similarly, and in 2021, this is where we really, I really started doing the heavy work of launching Rhizome. The winter storm Uri, as Susan mentioned, hit Texas. All of the interdependencies of the electric system based on the natural gas system, and then having critical infrastructure reliant on both of those systems, caused the entire Texas power grid and the water systems and the gas systems to entirely fail. And this really brought to bear for me as a native Texan that we can be doing a lot more to better anticipate which specific assets, facilities can fail, and how to best prevent that from happening. One of the major findings from the reporting from Winter Storm Uri is that some assets simply weren't winterized, right? Because Texas had never seen these types of freezes before. So what really brought into my mind at this point was we need a better account for future extreme weather events. And I know of climate science that is able to provide that information to infrastructure operators, but there's currently a major gap in that process. And so what it effectively meant, and if you were to encapsulate it on one slide, is that ICF refers to this entire problem as a $500 billion resilience investment gap. That is the amount of investment that's required by electric utilities to mitigate the future increases in costs and impacts from those extreme weather events. In 2023, we saw the most number of billion-dollar disasters in the US at 28, and that's only increasing over time. So obviously extreme weather is creating an upward pressure on this investment gap. Meanwhile, as the electric system is aging, so over half of the utility transmission and distribution poles are over 50 years old, whereas between 30 and 50 years is anticipated to be their useful life. So more than half of all infrastructure in this country on the electric system is exceeding their expected lifespan. And at the same time, there are downward pressures. There's a massive amount of capital that electric utilities, especially on the distribution system, are placing to upgrade and harden the system from those extreme weather events. The only problem is that $35 billion a year isn't nearly enough to counter the $500 billion and growing resilience investment gap. We need to be smarter about where we're placing those investments, and also help increase the level of those investments. So obviously the federal government is playing a major role through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but utility regulators also play a massive role. They're the ones that are approving utility investment plans. And if utilities are unable to justify the reliability and resilience investments in those plans, then we're simply not going to make the investments that are required. So I've written about this for now the last few years about the regulatory angle and how utility action is just as important as regulatory action. But when we dove in straight with utilities, we found some specific resilience-related challenges. Number one is definitely that the regulatory justification for their everyday investments is actually very difficult. How do you quantify the future value of resilience when it's hard to get information from your system today, right? Number two is they have limited visibility into extreme weather risk. And this is where there's a ton of weather and climate data out there that can help characterize risk on the system that simply isn't being used. And number three is that the asset planners and engineers are overwhelmed at distribution utilities. And if you know anything about utilities, it's really hard to increase resources. And the more that they have actual tools to make their lives easier and their jobs better, the better decisions that they're going to be making related to investments on the system that actually make a difference. And so when you translate these three challenges into the daily life cycle of a utility asset planner and engineer, you see they have robust systems related to managing assets, right? They identify the age, condition of their assets and create work orders from it. On the other end of the spectrum, or if you go up the chain, you have investment planning that's done really at an executive level from a financial planning group. But right in the middle is a huge gap where spreadsheets and Power BI tools are being used to create projects from scratch. That is, and these projects are anything from undergrounding, replacing aging assets, doing vegetation management, rebuilding a line, or even deploying devices that can help self-heal the grid called reclosers. And all of this project planning is done with a lack of tools and a lack of data and takes a ton of time from asset planners and engineers. And so what we've done is have architected a platform where we create effectively a digital twin of a utilities transmission and distribution system. We are able to layer on lots of pieces of data from the utility system, as well as external, including weather and climate, to make it easy for the asset planners and engineers to assess the vulnerabilities, create projects within the tool, and automatically understand what the cost benefit is going to be. We'll dive into that cost benefit metric in a little bit, but generally speaking, that cost benefit metric is very hard to come by today, and we're trying to make it as seamless as possible. And then lastly is going further downstream on the workflow is actually doing the reporting capabilities that justify those investments to regulator through robust impact metrics. We started working with several utilities, CenterPoint Energy, Portland General, Seattle City Light, have partnerships with some of the most important national labs in the sector working on this resilience challenge, and are also an advisory group member to the R&D arm of the electric utility industry, which is EPRI's Climate Ready program. So there's a lot of climate science that goes into this combined with utility engineering that makes this platform possible. And what we aim to do through the creation of our models is, first of all, we realize very quickly that we need to develop a really scalable and large data infrastructure system to ingest data from the utilities. And we generally take their historical outages, their asset data, data related to their systems and networks. We combine that with weather and climate information. So that's both the historical weather, what were the conditions that occurred when specific failures or outages happen. And we also look at vegetation, that is characterizing the canopy height, the proximity to the infrastructure, as that's a major driver of power outages and power failures. And then lastly, is we look at customers and socioeconomic information to make sure that decisions are being made equitably and that vulnerability from communities is actually taken into consideration as some major health and safety impacts can occur with especially poorer communities that don't have as good of access to resources. So we take data from all of the features that really matter when it comes to understanding what the impacts are of weather on the electric system, structure it into a database, and then train learning algorithms to understand what the likelihood of failure is when given the presence of high winds or given the presence of extreme heat that causes transformers to overload. Estimate that probability of failure in the future doing climate modeling that's understanding what the return period is going to be of a 2-year event, a 5-year event, or a 10-year event. So if a Category 1 hurricane is happening every 5 years today, that's actually likely to increase pretty dramatically in the future, likely going to be a 1 and 2-year event. And so that's what the climate models are generally telling us about the system. And if we have that forward-looking projection of extreme weather events, then you can actually anticipate what are the outages that are likely to occur and what's going to be the impact to the system and customers in the process over the long term, forecasting for various decades. So in our modeling process, as I mentioned, we look at the historical impacts of weather conditions, vegetation, and how that's led to outages in the past. And we do this analysis at really every circuit that a utility has. We forecast risk profiles at the circuit level using climate models to anticipate, given the return period of extreme weather events, what are going to be the likely impacts to the system. And then lastly, given the various investments that utilities are making, some of which I mentioned, but also newer ones like deploying batteries, deploying microgrids, or even leveraging electric vehicles, customer-owned electric vehicles as a resource during those peak load times, we can anticipate what are going to be the annual benefits. That is, how much risk is going to be reduced annually by making an investment. And that's the area under the curve that you see here. That's what we translate into a cost-benefit analysis. In terms of the costs that end up formulating our risk formulas, we look at the economic losses from power outages. That is looking at every customer, what they would pay to have energy for a given duration. And we also look at restoration costs as well. Given a storm that hits, what's the labor that goes into mobilizing resources, getting mutual aid, as well as replacing a pole or rebuilding a line that came down. And when we calculate the benefits of those reduced costs from an investment that's proactively made, we can come out with an NPV metric that effectively compares one investment to another per location anywhere on the system. So if a utility, for instance, is deciding whether to underground a full lateral line or just keep doing vegetation management, there are clear cost-benefit metrics that can be generated for either, and the right unbiased approach is to use that data to actually inform that decision. And I just wanted to dive into a bit of a case study from Seattle City Light. Seattle City Light was really trying to understand, and they've seen a trend of more frequent weather events from wind and precipitation, but then of course also from extreme heat. But they really wanted to understand what are going to be the future trends of wind-driven outages as well as precipitation-driven outages. And the goals of this project were to forecast outages at a feeder level, to overlay environmental justice metrics to understand where disadvantaged communities were, and then to ultimately actually do something about it, right? And in this case, they have a budget for deploying distribution automation, and this is a series of switches that can help reroute power when outages do occur. So instead of say 100 customers losing power given some section of the line goes down, you can reroute power so only 10 customers lose power, right? So 90% outage savings for the same type of failure on the assets that occurs. And you want to prioritize those switch deployments because there are close to an infinite number of places where you can deploy those switches on the ladders and feeders that are anticipated to have the highest number of extreme weather related outages. And as you can see from the graph here, what we were able to do was forecast the extreme weather events from a 2-year event, a 5-year event, and a 10-year event, both precipitation and wind, over the next decades. So as you can see, this is the response in the outages, but extreme weather events are likely to trend upward, and that's especially from the 10-year events, that's likely to drive up outages almost by 2x over the course of the next decades. And given that future-looking risk profile, we were able to help them reprioritize from their existing model where they put those switches to reduce the most amount of future outages as opposed to their current understanding of the system. We also look at every single asset that a utility has data on. That includes their poles, their conductors, and the transformers as well. And we looked specifically at what the effect was of extreme heat on the failure rate of Seattle City Lights transformers. And as you can see from the data over here, there really isn't much of an impact on transformers when it comes to the 95 percentile events. The 2-year events have a little bit of impact, 5-year events, a little bit of impact with some uncertainty. But what really drives transformer related outages is 10-year heat events. And sure enough, when you look at the forecast for 10-year heat events, those are looking to be a 1 in 5-year event or a 1 in 2-year event over the next 10 to 20 years. So given the change in extreme heat events and given the shortage in transformers, Seattle City Light, in our recommendation to them, is to effectively look at a high resolution at which transformers are going to experience failure and proactively upgrade those transformers. Because getting a replacement transformer in an emergency can be really dicey territory, and it can take a long time to restore customers from a failed transformers as a result of an extreme heat day. So, and I'm going to go ahead and close by talking about our thesis around measuring system resilience down all the way to the customer level. Because at the end of the day, right now, utilities are really solving for the system resilience metrics. What's our duration and frequency of outages at a lateral level or at a circuit level? But what really matters at the end of the day when you're looking at resilience is understanding what impact it's having for each customer. Does a customer have a backup generator? Do they have, are they on life support? All these characteristics matter when it comes to understanding if customers actually experience some level of vulnerability from a prolonged power outage. So having data and metrics on each and every customer and indicating their vulnerability is where we're effectively trying to get electric utilities to go, because getting these insights can not only help make infrastructure decisions, but also help target programs that utilities are already doing on a regular basis, like behind the meter battery storage incentives, electric vehicle incentives, energy efficiency programs, demand response, so on and so forth, can all be useful resources when mitigating the impacts from extreme weather. And that's about it. Happy to take any questions, and I know we're going to have a bit of discussion, but thank you very much for the time.
Awesome. That was great. Thanks, Mishal. All right, I put it in the chat. But please, any questions? You have Q&A for Susan and Mish. Drop it in the chat. Braden and I, well, we always start with Q&A. We reserve the right as the host to start asking questions, and then everybody else can feel free to jump in. But so my first question is a kind of a broad one for y'all. You both mentioned, here's the thing, there's the word reliability and the word resilience, and you both use those words. And like, I think I can kind of gather from your presentations the difference between the two, but could you elaborate a little bit more? Like when we say reliability, what we mean versus when we say resilience, what we mean, and like what goes into thinking about that from the utility perspective?
Go ahead, Mish.
I was going to let you go first, but thanks. I'll take the baton there.
Yeah.
So that's a really good question. And by the way, you can talk to experts, utilities, folks all across the country, and people are going to give you different answers to this. So it's not like there's an existing set definition, even though IEEE is working on refining those definitions. But the way that I like to think about it is, what are we actually trying to solve for? Right. And as I mentioned in my presentation, utilities are really good at solving for reliability, and you can track reliability through metrics from the frequency and duration of outages. And typically we look at that on normal condition days. So the utility is only responsible for the system when it doesn't account for the extreme weather days. And that's how they report to regulators. They report regular outages, and they report major event day outages. But when you're actually trying to solve for resilience, you actually have to take other things into consideration. There are real costs and impacts that separate resilience from reliability. I mentioned costs of restoration and health and safety impacts to customers. Typically, when you're trying to solve for reliability, those two things largely don't come into play. So when you're trying to model for resilience, you have to take into account what those impacts and what the responsibility of the grid operator actually is. And so very real costs that skyrocket and very real impacts that skyrocket that you can't solve for if you're only looking at reliability metrics.
You want
Yeah.
to jump in, Susan? I mean,
Yeah,
so
I mean-
reliability is how often is the power on?
Right. Correct. And I agree. I see it, and Mish had on his slides a list of the metrics that the industry uses, KD, SAFE, to keep track of that reliability. And what we're both saying is there's a gap when it comes to resilience metrics. And those metrics, we're attempting to fill that gap with quantifiable metrics that can eventually be adopted by ANSI and ISO and so forth. But I think that there's a general consensus that whereas reliability handles the day-to-day, resilience handles the high impact, low frequency events, the unknown unknowns. So it's both unknown from the perspective of how likely is it that it's going to happen, and from the perspective of how bad the calamity is going to be. And as Mish points out, there's a lack of metrics, not only for handling the risk, the financial risk in relation to long-term catastrophic scale events. I'll pause there and say there's clearly a deficit here. We see that because insurance companies are moving out of markets, right? They're moving out of markets because they don't have a good handle on quantifying risk. And so it's terribly important to be able to assess the risk of unknown unknowns. And at the same time, Misha's also underscored the importance of the fact that our current rate system looks at the cost to the utility, but not the cost to the community. Not just, and those costs are to critical customers. So a great example is the baby formula shortage. Well, what utility is going to be worried about supplying water or power to the baby formula plant? Before there was a national shortage, nobody would have understood that as an important consequence of the resilience of a utility, and in that case of a supply chain. But so it's not just the under-resourced communities among us, but it's also just our major manufacturers, is to get an understanding of what the secondary consequences are to outages. So I think Mish is right, both on the metric side for the engineers and on the consequence side for the community and the economy. There are also, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to develop those metrics.
How much of this is, I think you both sort of referenced it, right? On the shoulders of the utilities versus on the shoulders of the regulators to understand this gap. And is there more we should be doing on the helping the regulators understand the gap? And I know that both of y'all, like, your customers are utilities.
Correct.
Basically, right? Like, your customers are the utilities, but there's some level of this where the regulator has to tell the utility, yeah, you need to be doing more, using more services like this, and we're gonna enable you to do it. So how much of this is about influencing the sort of state level regulators?
I have a point of view on that. I think that, we're in both of us come from a policy background. It's a moment where that matters a lot. But it's kind of a give and take. So our approach is to develop metrics at the utility level that relate to resilience and take them to the regulators, to the state rate commissions, and say, hey, here's a way of looking at these investments. And by linking reliability and resilience, by beginning to show the metrics, by beginning to add incremental costs that aren't overwhelming, don't require, one of the problems PG&E had was that they were proposing the undergrounding of every single line in their system. Obviously, the costs were insurmountable. But had you been able to say, look, if you focus here, here, and here, you're going to get an enormous benefit because you're going to tackle the places that would result in a much greater impact, much greater cascade risk, you could potentially have afforded it even at the time. So part of this is supplying tools that make these costs manageable. And part of it is having a discussion at the federal level. Of course, we know that in the nuclear industry, catastrophes are funded federally above a certain level. That has been accepted. Are we going to have the same conversation about other kinds of catastrophic risk? Probably, inevitably, we are. We already have that hidden in the FEMA costs, which continue to escalate. So our view is you need to get a handle on those metrics so that these costs, you could have a rational discussion about these costs at the state regulation, but also ultimately at the federal level.
Yeah, that I think Susan hits on a lot of great points. So I'll just add maybe a dimension here, which is so I spend almost as much time in front of regulators as I do our utility customers, states all over the country, and I go to neighbor conferences, and we really do our best job to communicate what is possible in communicating resilience from the utility to regulators, because they just simply don't know what is possible. So. But the way that I would describe it is that there is an incentive misalignment. Right now, utilities are managed by reliability metrics that don't account for resilience, but are driven by their capital expenditures. Meanwhile, you have the regulator, which is driven by, well, of course, politics, but also driven by making sure that customer value is seen from utility investments, that they're being held accountable for safety, affordability, and reliability. And that, when it comes to resilience, there's currently isn't a framework for how regulators really enable utilities to meet those objectives. So, of course, the utility needs to do more, and regulators should make them do more. But at the same time, it should also align with their CapEx incentives. So what we've been doing is popularizing the notion of resilience regulatory frameworks that can be adopted by states that allows utility to spend capital dollars on incremental resilience projects as long as they meet certain criteria. So they have to do a risk assessment on the grid of various threats and how those threats will impact the system. They have to put together investments and alternative scenarios and actually demonstrate how those investments are going to reduce those specific risks that were identified. They need to develop measures and metrics for how to track those resilience outcomes and actually report it to the regulator. And they actually need to take things like equity into consideration, right? So all of these pillars are involved in a really good resilience regulatory framework, and we are trying to help commissions conduct investigations or develop working groups so that they can actually codify rules that encourage the utility to take action related to these resilience mechanisms while giving them the carrot of allowing them to invest and earn reasonable cost recovery on those investments.
That makes sense.
I think that approach, that is essentially the approach of the water sector today, codified in the American Water Infrastructure Act. It's a legislatively mandated assessment. So it'd say that the power industry can learn from the water industry. NERC has things to teach the water industry. So I think we're moving ahead. We're trying to make sure that whatever metrics and approaches are adopted in one sector are adopted in another, because everything is interconnected. And you ultimately need to be able to allocate capital efficiently cross-sectorally. For example, in Winter Storm Uri, the gas pipes froze. There were enormous consequences to 1,000 water systems and 700 deaths at that end of it. The grid went down in between. Every water system was mandated to do things. Where should the capital best be allocated and why? And how are you going to pay for that? So I think that you know, all of these steps, the frameworks, the finances, the mitigation are all important.
Well, it's complicated. It's a complicated topic, so you have to figure out how to weave it all together. All right, we're getting close to time. So if somebody else has another question, jump it in the chat. But this being the related to Fairfax County and Northern Virginia and the DMV and Virginia, I did want to get in. I know without you all like having done an assessment of all the assets in the region, but off the top of your head, which I'm sure you appreciate, like what are, you know, we've talked about different events, we've talked about different types of catastrophes, we've talked about different types of heat days, you know, and issues like that. Like, Mish, as you're sitting in the region, like what are the things that you're concerned about, knowing what's in your models? Like, what are the things that we should be thinking about as ratepayers and customers and energy professionals in this area?
Yeah, there are a couple of things, right? As the climate models show, is number one is we're anticipated to get a higher frequency of tropical storms in the region. And we have a lot of overhead infrastructure in the region. In DC, we're actually trying to underground a significant portion of the system, known as the Power Line Undergrounding Program. Virginia has a strategic undergrounding program that they actually got codified through legislation. And so all of those investments that are being made by the utilities are good to account for the growing risks of those storms, but I have a suspicion that we're probably going to need to do a little bit more. At the same time, the extreme cold events and the extreme heat events are likely to grow. So what that means is, you know, as the region electrifies, as we buy more EVs, and I know Maryland has been doing a lot on the vehicle electrification side of things. Obviously, DC has quite a bit of trends going in that direction as well. As we start to shape new peaks at every single circuit on the system, we need to better scale and target the programs related to efficiency, demand reduction, and battery storage to account for those growing peaks and the likely outages and impacts of the system they're going to have, but also to defer any future infrastructure upgrades that would be coming down the line that further increase rates more than they already are. And utilities, I think, have never been as capital constrained as they are today with this current spurt of growing electrification. So making sure that the investments are made as efficiently as possible through all of the resources available is what I'm hoping increases in the DMV.
Well, I would say that, you know, the thing that I mean, I'm just going to switch the perspective a little and just say, I think that what we need to work on is collaboration. We need to work on a better understanding of each other's systems, how they interact. You know, whether it's telecom with electric with water. These systems are dependent on each other, and there's generally a wall between them. And ultimately, that makes it, you know, guesswork on the part of each sector, what their risks are. And this is something that over time has to be developed. So I think through the collaborative processes of the Council of Governments and other organizations focused on emergency management, we have to begin to break down these walls and come together more as communities to face these risks together.
All right. Well, I've taken up a lot of the question time. I appreciate it. I think this was really awesome. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for letting us record this. It'll be up on our YouTube, right, Bobby? Eventually we'll get this up with the other ones. I think it's a really important topic. I think to your point, Mish, now I'm terrified of like how the modeling is going for the 10-year climate events turning into 2-year climate events. This because I'm sure it keeps everyone else awake at night. But this was really great. I appreciate you doing this. We'll have more Lunch and Learns in the future. Check out our website. It's dominnovation.com for more events coming up soon because they're coming fast and furious right now. And then Debbie, do you want to close us out with any other words from Smart Cities?
Absolutely. I just want to thank you all again for joining us today, each of you as presenters, sponsors, and participants. We appreciate your time. And we too will have this link posted up on our website, smartcityworks.org, and you can check us out there for our next panels, which are on venture capital in Smart City Works and AI in Smart City Works. And again, one more plug for our May 16th pitch finale. We hope to see many of you there and hope that our startups are continuing to create companies and solutions to the problems that you all have named. Really appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. All right, everybody have a great afternoon, and we will see you at the pitch finale in May. That'll be a fun time.